Hello and welcome to another edition of The Front Page on GNAT TV. My name is Andrew McKeever. I'm the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. It's also my pleasure today to have with us in the studio two distinguished guests. Rebecca Holcombe is the Secretary of Education here in Vermont, and Dan French is the Superintendent of the Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union. And welcome to you both.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for making the time out of what I know is a busy schedule to be with us today to share some of the thinking about what's going on in education in Vermont, which is a perennial hot topic, it seems, around the state. And Ms. Holcombe, let me start with you. You've been the Education Secretary now for about 2 months. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing education in the state, or what keeps you awake at night when you think about how we need to improve or do better in one way or another?
It's a perennial hot topic because I think Vermonters care so much about the outcomes of education. And one of the things that really motivates me is that the world has changed dramatically. And information technology, for example, is transforming the work we do as grown-ups, but also the work we do in schools. And I'm conscious of the fact that when I go to a CVS and check out, I'm checking out from a kiosk. If I go buy an airplane ticket, I'm checking out from a machine. Many of the jobs that our graduates from our high schools used to leave high school and go and take don't exist. In fact, they're estimating now that 60% of the jobs that our graduates will take haven't been invented yet. So that has really changed the game of education. We can't educate children right now for some terminal job because we don't know what that job will be. We need to instead be educating our children to do the kind of work that computers can't do. We need to be training them or helping them learn how to think, reason from evidence, think critically, solve non-routine problems, because these are the kinds of things that computers can't do. And this is what we have to do in schools. The other big change that's taking place is that we can no longer afford to provide the best education to a subset of our students and assume that other students who aren't skilled and reaching those same high levels of attainment will be able to get jobs that pay them well enough to thrive in their communities and beyond. We now have to educate everybody to much higher levels than before. And when we look at our own Vermont data, what we see is, in particular, we're doing really well for some groups, but in particular, our young men from low-income backgrounds are not getting the skills that we need them to get to be able to work in meaningful ways in the future. And that keeps me up at night because these are our brothers, these are our husbands, these are people who are going to grow up and be our voters, and we need them to be able to live meaningful lives, fulfilling lives, to work in whatever jobs they choose, and participate in the civic life of their community. And the way we educate needs to be reaching everybody systematically and equipping them with that set of skills, and that's a big transformation. And I know we share many of the same, but I'm sure you have many things you want to weigh in as well. Because
I agree. It's an exciting yet challenging context, and the implications of technology and learning are pretty significant, not only for expanding learning opportunities for kids, but I think they're also going to change fundamentally how our organizations work and our structure. I think the other contextual issues that are a significant concern are the cost efficiencies of Vermont's public education system. Our delivery system, is basically the one we've had for 150 some odd years, and I'm concerned that we're reaching a sort of a critical point in terms of financing it, and I personally don't have too many more tricks up my sleeves to gain efficiencies from our current structure in the BRSU. I'm also concerned with federal education policy, which Vermont has kind of gone its own way to a certain extent and not obtaining a waiver, which I certainly applauded. But I think it's been such a challenging environment, policy standpoint. From a lot of what we have to do now is defend our system from unfair political attacks, essentially. And it's been a very challenging environment. At the same time, we've lost a lot of resources, so we're expected to do more. People are throwing rocks at us, and it's just
something that's
no, and it's right. It's just so I'd say the combination of those three things, particularly in Vermont, make it a very challenging environment right now.
I think as Superintendent French said, I think we're in a paradoxical situation right now where we are still under No Child Left Behind because we declined to pursue a waiver. And that means effectively, as of this year, every school in the state of Vermont will be considered a failing school under the federal government's policy. But at the same time, this fall, the federal government issued a report that placed us 7th in the world behind Massachusetts and a number of Asian, we call them test tigers, in terms of science and math. So this data it becomes absurd at some point. Are we good? Are we not good? And it's also not useful. I think what we all care about deeply in schools is really actually how you get better. It's not how well you're doing, because we know how we're doing. What we need to figure out is how to get better. And the kind of data that we have under federal policy right now actually doesn't do that much to help us figure out what we can do and where we can begin to change our schools to help students learn more effectively.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because I guess we're in a period of transition from the old kneecap tests that have been used for the past few years to determine whether students are learning at an adequate rate or not. And we're now going to be transitioning, as I understand it, into the new Common Core framework. Can you tell us a little bit about the Common Core and how it's going to be different from the kneecap test? I mean, my understanding of it so far is that it's been touted as a more difficult test. It's more computer-based, I also gather. But how will it be different for Vermont students taking this test compared to the old kneecap ones we're familiar with?
I want to start just by separating the Common Core from the test, because the Common Core is actually a very different entity. It's really our best. It's an aspirational document that describes what we want our students to know and be able to do. And it really is a description of learning outcomes. It's not a test in and of itself. There are several tests being developed to assess student learning with respect to the Common Core. And one of those is the Smarter Balanced Assessment, which we will be working with in Vermont. But the test itself is different from the curriculum. And you may have thoughts on that as well.
No,
but I think it's
totally
really important to separate those two, because a test may have strengths and weaknesses, but that doesn't really speak to the strengths and weaknesses of the core. And I think when we talk about the Common Core, I think we can agree that it's probably the best current articulation we have of the ambitious sort of 21st century goals we have. And with respect to the Common Core, we are going to ask Vermont teachers to do what good Vermont teachers have always done, which is look at it, look at their students, figure out the kinds of changes in thinking we're trying to cultivate in our students, but use their own professional judgment about what's appropriate. And the example I always give is that when students come into Superintendent French's kindergartens, some of them can read chapter books, some of them have never seen a book. And what's good teaching for those children is different. We may still hold the same goals for them at the end of their educational trajectory, but what they need in the moment is different, and it's something that we have to rely on professional judgment of teachers to address appropriately. The tests that we're going to use in Vermont are the Smarter Balanced Assessments. They are computer adaptive, and we actually feel they're better tests than the existing kneecap test for several reasons, and I'll tell you some of them. First of all, because it's a computer adaptive test, it will select items for each student that are really appropriate to that student's level of understanding and mastery. So with the previous test, for example, a student might sit down to take the paper and pencil kneecap. One student who was struggling academically might not be able to answer any items on the test. Another student who was really extraordinary might answer every question easily. And in both of those cases, we don't really know how much those children know what they can do, because the test isn't designed to measure their mastery effectively. With the Smarter Balanced Assessment, schools will have much more precise measures of each student's level of mastery. So that is a useful tool in terms of giving appropriate feedback. That said, and in addition to that, it tests a broader, I should add, because it's computer adaptive, it can incorporate video, it can incorporate spoken components, so that it can assess comprehension on not just written passages, but also on your sort of auditory comprehension, which we also think is a critical skill. It's also got some adaptations in it that make it more successful for students with certain disabilities, so that we'll have more reliable measures of what students with certain disabilities can do than we would have had with the kneecap. So overall, technically, it's a better test. It's still a standardized test that only samples a very small amount of what we want our students to know and be able to do. And so if you go to the education quality standards, for example, that were approved last December by the State Board of Ed, that document clearly outlines 7 goals for students, for all Vermont students, that we think really describe critical outcomes for Vermont students. It includes English language arts, which is measured by the SBAC. It includes math, also measured by the Smarter Balance. It also includes science, which is currently measured by the kneecap, and there'll be a new assessment phased in over the next several years. But it doesn't, the tests don't measure student outcomes in civics and history and social studies, don't measure student outcomes in the arts, in wellness and health, and don't measure outcomes in many of the kinds of transferable 21st century skills that we were speaking about a minute ago. And so we're still going to be looking for other tools, including locally developed tools, like some of the ones I saw in your schools today, that really speak to some of the other critical outcomes, things that we think are really important for students to know and do that aren't captured in those tests. So they're a tool. They don't tell us everything, but they tell us something.
Dan, when will the SBAC tests begin to be integrated into the curriculum? Is that coming up this spring, or is that later on this spring?
Well, I think Secretary Holcombe could answer that better than I.
The test will be field tested in a number of schools, 27 schools this spring. So there are 27 schools that did not take the kneecaps last fall.
Okay.
And so they don't have scores for this year. Instead, they're going to pilot the Smarter Balance assessment this spring. And we won't actually have individual level scores. They're using that pilot field test to do some testing of the test itself and improve the design of the test and also figure out how to score it appropriately. And then everyone will take the test in the following year. So if you followed the news reports about the kneecap results this year, we were working very hard to make sure people didn't make state-level comparisons from this year to last year, because we know that the sample that took the kneecap this year was different than last year, and actually it's not representative. So we're in the process of that transition already. Before
we leave the whole issue of assessment tests, I guess I've often been baffled over the past few years trying to interpret them. What am I supposed to make of the fact that X percentage of schools in the state failed in some subgroup or another? Failed is a word I know that a lot of educators don't like, but didn't meet the level that the original No Child Left Behind legislation in 2002 was. But now everybody was supposed to be proficient, I guess, by 2014, and well, I guess that isn't the case. But Dan, let me go to you. What are we supposed to make of them? I mean, are they good tests? Or is it good data? Or is it just kind of one tool among several?
Well, just to echo Secretary Holcomb's comments, I think it's important to separate out aspects of this. So we're talking about federal school reform policy that includes standards, a standards-based assessment, and then an accountability system. So, we've talked a bit about the Common Core as being different from the test, what's going to be the SBAC. The third element, the accountability system, is what you're referring to, how this all comes together and how schools are determined to be in need of improvement, if you will. That, as I understand, has not been put together in terms of what the SBAC, how that's going to be implemented, how schools will be held accountable. But it is, as I was saying earlier, in terms of getting rocks thrown at us, it's really hard to explain. We have a lot of other indicators that show students are doing well, so we've tried to approach it from that way. But on the other hand, we want to be very responsible and look at the data, and if there's something we can learn from the data in terms of improving instruction, we're all for it. I think the challenge with kneecap data in particular is that we didn't get it in a timely manner. So we talk a lot in our district, because we're really interested in understanding to what extent assessment interrupts instructional time. And I think are we testing too much will be a big question before everyone. So we talk about an efficient assessment being one that provides data simultaneously to three levels in the organization. One we call the formative level, meaning that teachers can immediately, within several weeks anyway, take that data and make some instructional decisions on how to intervene with student learning. The second level would be an administrative evaluation level, meaning we wanted the ability to evaluate professional development programs, curriculum programs, are they working based on outcomes for students. The third level is assurance to the school board and to our communities that our schools are doing well. So the problem right now I see with the kneecap anyway is that we have limited formative data coming out of that. We have virtually no evaluative data, and then we get this whole rock-throwing mentality on the policy level. I'm certainly hopeful that SBAC will provide the formative data. I understand that's going to be an option available to us as a state that will perhaps be able to use it more efficiently on that end. So I think it's kind of a complicated topic in that we have some really new tools in terms of assessment that are really promising in education. On the other hand, we're in a very difficult political context, in terms of how those tools get applied. And I'm not convinced as a country we've really come to grips with that. I think certainly our federal government is kind of paralyzed over the issue. They haven't been able to come together to reauthorize No Child Left Behind Act, which I personally think has been a complete failure, largely because all the schools are failing. But I think it increasingly is probably one of our more complicated political things that I have to address as a superintendent, and that's how I view it. I view it as a political problem, not an educational problem, and I talk about it that way when I talk to the school boards. We have educational issues and we have political issues. all the No Child Left Behind Act has now become a political issue for me to address. It consumes a lot of time. And
I think it's important to point out that even though we're all failing under No Child Left Behind, our NAEP scores are higher than they've ever been, and
Right.
we also are keeping more students
That's the
in.
National Association of Education Progress.
Yes, which
National
people call the gold standard. I mean,
Right.
because it's been
That's a
continuous
national
over years.
test.
It's a national test, and
Yeah.
but I think most importantly, it doesn't have any stakes attached to it, so it's not subject to distortion the way some of the state tests are. And I think it's. I think it's important to know that, first of all, we have more students staying in school and finishing school, so the composition of students taking the test is more diverse, but our scores are still higher than they've ever been on that test. And to me, that's a really important thing to note. We're actually doing better than we've ever done, even though we're being labeled as a failing test. I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is this whole issue of multiple measures. And I think we do need multiple measures. Some students will never test as well on a standardized test as they might in some other context. Standardized tests will tell us one piece. If it's the only measure we're using to measure our schools, we're going to limit ourselves to a very narrow band of learning in tested subjects. There's been good research in some other states around how teaching narrowly to the test has really distorted what we think of as education. I think that's potentially destructive. But I think the other, well, I think that's the big piece. Or something else you were going to say. You have to go back to your question because I forgot when I was listening to your good answer.
No, no, I would just.
I know what it is.
yeah.
Separating the use of the test from the test itself. There's nothing wrong with a Smarter Balanced Assessment. It's a good test. The problem is in the uses we assign to the test data.
Okay.
And you mentioned the labeling, sort of the categorical labeling
Yeah.
of performance as proficient or not proficient, college ready or not college ready. The labels are the problems, and then the stakes or the sanctions we attach to schools to tell us that all of your schools are failing because not every single student in every single school is achieving proficient is problematic. And it's putting a normative label. And the other problem with these performance categories is that, I was talking to someone in a district the other day, and they've managed to, every single student who's on free and reduced lunch is performing above proficient, which is a good thing. But their mean score hasn't changed. The average score of their students hasn't moved. So what they've done is they've redistributed learning. But if you look at the actual scale scores, and I know this is getting very technical and mathematical, the problem with those performance category labels is it may tell you one story that isn't actually the true story of what's going on in learning. And when I look at score data, I'm actually not looking at whether you're what percent proficient you have, because I don't actually find that very meaningful. What I'm looking at is patterns and changes in the mean scores. On average, are our boys doing better? On average, are our young poor boys doing better? On average, overall, is there growth and improvement happening in this school? Because that tells you a very different story sometimes than the performance categories.
Let me ask you a question. Why do boys tend to perform worse than girls on these tests?
There's a whole bunch of research on that, and you'd have to call an academic in to tell you what the real answer is. But I think that there's several possible hypotheses, and actually I hope we can go back to your personalized learning, because I think that's a piece of the
That's
answer
our hypothesis,
to it.
yeah.
And part of it is that some subgroups in our population may not see the academic learning in school as being relevant or meaningful to their purposes in life, where they want to go. And some of the programs that we're seeing having greater success with these young men are programs that are really emphasizing real-life applications of learning, trying to get students out working in a personalized way with them, so that they understand when they're doing this work in school, it's actually going to help them do something that's meaningful to them in their work or in their communities.
Okay. Let's just turn to the other big question, I guess, in the education arena today, and it's again a perennial one: financing and governance. The House Education Committee, as you know, has a bill before it that it's considering that would basically redraw the map in terms of school districts and number of school boards. I guess slim down the governance structure of the state. Right now, we have a very low per capita ratio between number of school directors and students, and a low student teacher ratio. We spend per capita, I think we're number 1 or number 2 in the country in terms of dollars per student. This bill, I gather, would attempt to rein that in somewhat. We have a 5-cent property tax increase going in this year, 7-cent increase slated for next year at this point. What do you think about that bill? Is that a step in the right direction, or is it a non-starter?
I think I think I would always go back to what's the purpose? Why is this even being discussed as a possibility? And I think there's several factors that I've heard in my conversations with the legislature that seem to be driving the conversation. And the first, I think you alluded to this earlier, is that we've had, you know, a 20% drop in enrollments and students in the state, but we haven't had any adjustment in the number of faculty, of teachers actually teaching those students, and that's of some concern to people as well. So we're declining enrollments, but we aren't seeing that kind of structural readjustment that we would have expected. I think the two other big issues that I'm hearing a lot about are accountability. It's difficult to compare across districts, across schools, because costs are lodged at different levels in the system, and so it's hard to know who's educating and getting good results in a cost-effective way, so that can serve as a model for other districts. I mean, I think here you're doing some tremendous work, but it's hard to know how to make that a model for somebody else, because it's hard to compare your structure to structures across the state. And so part of it is about getting some public assurance response to voters so that they know when they're spending these dollars, how do they know how cost-effective those efforts are? And the other is about accountability. And when schools are very small, it's difficult to get data on some of them. In some places in the state, we're already seeing data reports coming back blank, because the number of students in the grade is so small that that isn't publicly available data, because it would be revealing information about individual students. And beyond that, it's really about how, given this tremendous challenge we face of trying to ensure that every child is provided with rich opportunities to learn, how do we organize and collaborate with each other to make sure that we have the capacity to deliver this 21st century education for kids? I mean, again, I was inspired by some of the work you're doing around professional development. You've been able to coordinate your system, but that's not possible in all systems.
Right, and I would echo that. I think that's one of our biggest reasons we really need to look at governance now, is just that I think the current system can't necessarily deliver what kids need to have for the 21st century, and certainly not equitably across the state. You know, we have pockets of places in our state where there's some wonderful things happening, and then we have other places where kids are really denied, I would say, an equal opportunity to a quality education. And as the 21st century learning skills become paramount, it's going to become increasingly important for the state to figure that out. So I think the current structure has served its purpose to a certain extent, but we have to really revisit it and think about in terms of, what are desired outcomes. Go back, I think that's a great way to phrase it, as Secretary Holcombe said, is what are we really trying to achieve? Along the way, we have to streamline things, certainly become more efficient. As I mentioned, in our own operation here at BRCU, as you know, we've taken on extra districts. We've done some consolidation at the central level. So
you have the one and only red in the state.
So we've, and as you know, with our conversation with our neighbors in Bat-Gill Valley, part of the conversation there was how big can a supervisory union get? And certainly it's a question our boards struggled with. And we've had to grow, so we take criticism that, our supervisory union budget's getting bigger all the time, and our school, we're centralizing things, so we're saving people money doing that. But no one remembers, that we cut the two other positions at the local level.
And in fact, part of the challenge has been that as functions are centralized at the SU, sometimes we've seen local boards backfill that hole that should have been in the budget at the local level, so it ends up being a net increase.
And it's just, we've struggled, I think, as a supervisory union, getting as big as we probably can get. I mean, we're really at that point. So, and I know with the red in particular, this is the Mountain Towns Regional Education District, there was no way we could have absorbed those school districts if they hadn't first consolidated into a single school district. So if we had to take on the 4 town school districts plus the Union District, 5 entities, separate tax IDs, all the stat reporting, everything else, we would have never been able to do that. So there is, I believe, a direct correlation between number of school districts and the size of these organizations. So I think a lot of things right now are pointing to the need to look at governance. So I'm hopeful, and I think really pleased with our board members, their willingness to engage in that conversation. I think that's really the disposition of everyone right now. I'm a little concerned. I mean, the bill hasn't even been produced as a bill, I think, and there's already people, running around speaking, alarming,
We shouldn't be afraid of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't think the answer is scripted yet. But just
there's no clear answer to it. But
people
need to engage.
They do need to engage because we do care, and we do want public engagement to figure out what the best solution is. But to speak to your issue about capacity, another piece of this whole puzzle is the turnover at the superintendent level and also the principal level. We have, on average, 30% turnover of principals every year in the state. We also have, at this point, 15 or 17, it looks like, superintendent vacancies. And if you thought about a business with 30% turnover in management every year, we would say it was in crisis. And I think when I talk to superintendents, and you can speak to this eloquently because it's your peers, but a lot of it has to do with the challenge of the job and the way it's structured. And I think if there is a way to make it so that the job is doable, my hope is that would stabilize the leadership so that they can do some of the kinds of collaboration that you're doing here in this district.
Well, we have time, I think, for about one last question. And Dan, let me throw this one to you. This is about the Innovation Zones idea that you had brought to our attention a few weeks ago.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that. It sounds like that's one of those kind of different sort of approaches to trying to boost educational outcomes.
Yeah, I think, you know, the work we've done here is indicative of work that's going around the country in terms of rethinking, you know, particularly how teachers work together and how we organize curriculum and professional development. And I think, you know, part of the answer to how we move forward is to allow people to sort of innovate in a structural way to do that. And I think in Vermont we've had a lot of pockets of excellence and pockets of innovation, but we need to learn better as a state how to innovate as a system, and that's really what's been lacking. So the idea is that we provide the structural mechanism for districts to present ideas, to work across district boundaries on a larger scale, and hopefully identify some promising practices that then could be shared more broadly across other parts of the state. Not to say we have necessarily those answers here, but I think it's an approach worthy of considering, because I think, you know, the path, as we've discussed, path through many of these challenges is not clear right now, and we're going to have to embark on a period of innovation, and at the same time we need to do that in a responsible way, you know, because we do have to provide assurance, and students you know, need to have their needs met. So we have to find the balance, and this was an attempt to sort of provide that from a policy standpoint.
Well, I guess we have time for one last question. I'll throw it over to you, Madam Secretary. Pre-kindergarten is another hot topic that has come up. I'm assuming that you think that that's a good idea if we were to expand the range of pre-K programs and the availability and accessibility of that to 3- and 4-year-old Vermonters.
I'm a big believer. We actually call it early education, and I really think of this.
No,
and it's wonderful. And the reason I do that is to emphasize that really learning begins in utero. You know, it starts even before you're born. And the nutrition that you're exposed to, the early language that you're exposed to, have profound impacts over the life of a child. There's really compelling research now. There was a study done last year that looked at the achievement gap of 24-month-olds. By the time you're 24 months old, there's already a 6-month gap in vocabulary development of children from low-income and high-income backgrounds. That's stunning when you think about the implications, because that gap just gets wider and wider, so that by the time they come to kindergarten now, it's huge. The other piece of research I find so compelling is some of the research around social-emotional regulation and behavior that shows that children who are exposed to prolonged stress and don't have the care of a supportive adult in those early years, that ends up manifesting itself down the road in an inability to regulate your own behavior in 19-year-olds and in people in the workforce. So that the foundation we lay in these early critical years ends up really affecting whether or not these children develop the basic brain structures they need to thrive when they enter the elementary school programs. So I absolutely support early childhood. I support parents as the first teachers of their children, and I support, I was speaking with your pre-K educators today, and they were talking about how important it is for them to actually work with parents and go into parents' homes and talk with parents about how they can work as a team to support early learners.
So right now it's optional for school districts to offer early education, not required.
And this would be universal pre-K, and it might be provided through the regular elementary program as a PK program within the building, or it might be by working with a private provider in the community.
Great. Well, I guess that'll just about do it for today, but I wanted to thank both Rebecca Holcombe, the Secretary of Education for Vermont, Daniel French, the Superintendent of the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union. Thank you both for being here with us today and taking the time out what I know is a busy day. And thank all of you for watching as well. This has been The Front Page on GNAT TV. Andrew McKeever here from the Manchester Journal. Been my pleasure. We'll see you the next time.